Most people think the dollar dies in one dramatic moment. A crash, a panic, a headline, a single day when the world wakes up and declares that the old order is over. That is not how these things usually happen. The real danger is slower than that. The real danger is dilution. That is the line I want you to keep in your head, because it explains almost everything that is happening beneath the noise. The United States dollar is not necessarily about to vanish. It is not being dragged out into the street and executed. It is something more subtle, and in many ways more important than that. It is being slowly downgraded from the only game in town to the strongest game in a much more crowded room. That shift will not feel cinematic, it will feel gradual. And because it feels gradual, most people will ignore it until the consequences are already sitting inside their portfolio. I have seen this sort of thing before in other forms. People become comfortable with a structure because it lasts long enough to feel permanent. Then they stop asking how that structure was maintained in the first place. They stop asking what privilege it granted. They stop asking who paid for that privilege. They stop asking what would happen if the privilege became less absolute. That is exactly where we are now. For decades, the United States enjoyed something few countries in history ever possessed. It had the world's reserve currency. That phrase sounds technical, but the essence is simple. The whole world needed dollars. They needed dollars to settle trade, to buy oil, to store reserves, to conduct the ordinary plumbing of global finance that gave the United States extraordinary room to behave more recklessly than other countries could ever afford to behave. It could run larger deficits, borrow more cheaply, create more obligations, and still enjoy a demand for its currency that other nations could only envy. That was not magic, that was structure, and structure, no matter how strong, is always vulnerable once the incentives around it begin to shift. That is what people are missing right now. They think the discussion is about whether China is dumping the dollar. That phrase is too dramatic to be useful. The deeper reality is not that one country flipped a switch. The deeper reality is that more countries are slowly deciding that relying too heavily on one currency, one payments architecture, and one geopolitical center comes with risks they no longer want to ignore. That matters. Because a reserve currency does not need to be fully replaced to become less powerful. It only needs to be used a little less, held a little less, trusted a little less, and bypassed a little more often. That is enough to begin changing the balance. I call this the monopoly fade. And the monopoly fade is one of the most important economic shifts an investor can understand. When a monopoly weakens, the leader does not necessarily collapse. It often remains huge, profitable, innovative, militarily powerful, and culturally dominant for a long time. But the returns that came from its uncontested position begin to soften. The margins of privilege shrink. The rest of the world finds ways to route around the old center. New growth appears elsewhere. Capital becomes more selective. The winner is no longer the investor who simply assumes the old order will compound exactly as it did before. The winner becomes the investor who notices that the map is getting wider. That is the real story. The dollar still has enormous advantages. That is why I find the collapse crowd unserious. The United States still has deep capital markets, extraordinary liquidity, military reach, powerful legal infrastructure, and some of the most important technology ecosystems on Earth. When a true global crisis appears, money still tends to run toward American assets rather than away from them. That is not an accident. It is because the rest of the world is not offering a cleaner, more trusted, more liquid replacement at scale. Europe has its own fractures, China has its own controls. Gold cannot settle modern trade with the speed and flexibility global commerce needs. Bitcoin has not proven itself stable enough to become the unquestioned foundation of world reserves. There is no single clean successor that matters enormously. It means the dollar can weaken without losing relevance. It means the old order can erode without disappearing. It means the transition is likely to be messy, uneven, and slower than alarmists say, while still being important enough to reshape returns over the next decade. That is why I tell people not to think in terms of collapse, think in terms of dilution. A country that once behaved like the only superpower becomes one very large superpower among others. A currency that once sat uncontested at the center remains central, but no longer monopolistic. A global investor who once could safely assume that owning America was enough now has to ask a more uncomfortable question. What if America remains great, but no longer uniquely sufficient? That is the question, and that question changes how capital should be positioned. Why is the monopoly fade happening at all? Part of it is arithmetic. The United States has asked the world to absorb more of its deficits, more of its debt, and more of its financial self-confidence than any empire can ask forever, without eventually testing the limits of goodwill and practicality. If you keep issuing claims against your own future, the rest of the world will eventually begin asking whether it wants every spare dollar of reserves tied to your promises. Part of it is geopolitics. When the United States froze Russian reserves after the Ukraine invasion, it made perfect sense from one perspective and sent a clear signal from another. The signal was simple. If you are outside the favored alliance and your reserves live inside a system the United States can influence, then your assets may not be as neutral as you once hoped. Once that lesson becomes visible, countries begin acting on it. They buy more gold, they settle more trade in local currencies, they build parallel payment rails, they test digital systems. They diversify not because they believe the dollar disappears tomorrow, because they no longer trust concentration. That is a rational response. And when many countries make a rational response in the same direction, an old order begins to soften around the edges. Part of it is simply the rise of the rest. The global economy is no longer as Western dominant as it once was. The share of activity coming from emerging economies, commodity producers, younger populations, and newer centers of production keeps increasing. Demography matters, industrial development matters, technology adoption matters, middle-class formation matters when enough of that happens outside the United States. A larger share of future equity returns begins living outside the United States too. That is where many American investors remain mentally behind. They have been trained by a half-century of American superiority to confuse still the best with best place for almost everything. Those are not the same sentence. America may remain the most important market in the world and still fail to be the market with the best relative returns over the next 10 or 20 years. That is the key distinction. Valuation matters, starting point matters, concentration matters. And if the most crowded, most expensive, most beloved market enters a period where its dominance is merely strong rather than unquestioned, then money does not need to flee for the opportunity set to improve elsewhere. It only needs to rotate. I have always respected rotation more than headlines. Headlines make people emotional, rotation makes people rich. Look at what is happening under the surface. The average American investor is massively tilted toward the United States. I understand why. It worked brilliantly for a long time. The S&P 500 rewarded loyalty, American technology rewarded loyalty, American innovation rewarded loyalty, broad dollar strength rewarded loyalty. But if the next 2 decades look different from the last 2 decades, and I think they probably will, then loyalty alone becomes a weaker strategy than intelligent diversification. Now, diversification is a word that has been abused so badly it almost sounds dull. I do not mean mindless diversification. I do not mean buying foreign exposure because it is fashionable. I mean something much simpler and more serious than that. Do not make one country the single point of failure in your financial life. That is the rule. Would I abandon the United States? Of course not. That would be foolish. The United States still has some of the finest businesses on earth, the deepest markets, the strongest legal architecture for capital, and an innovation pipeline that remains the envy of much of the world. The American machine is still a remarkable machine, but a remarkable machine can deliver lower relative returns than a younger, cheaper, faster-growing set of markets, starting from lower expectations. That is why I would not go all in on America and call it prudence. Prudence in this environment means acknowledging the monopoly fade and building around it. The first place I would look is international diversification done intelligently. Not because every foreign market is wonderful, because some of them are simply cheaper, younger, more underowned, and earlier in their cycle than the United States. That matters. A rich market with extraordinary companies can still produce mediocre forward returns if the starting prices already assume too much. A less loved market with good demographic wins, improving governance, rising consumption, and lower expectations can produce much better returns, simply because it is starting from a different place. That is why I pay so much attention to emerging markets, not all of them. Not blindly, but as a class they deserve much more respect than the average American portfolio currently gives them. India, in particular, is impossible to ignore over the long arc: younger population, growing scale, rising technological capability, expanding internal market. If it executes even reasonably well, it becomes one of the defining growth stories of the next generation. Other emerging regions will matter too, although unevenly. The point is not to pretend all developing markets are equal. The point is to understand that global growth is getting broader, and the investor who remains mentally trapped in a single country framework is standing in the wrong place while the world gets larger. The second place I would look is gold. Now, I have never been one of those people who believes gold solves every problem. Gold is not a business, it does not innovate, it does not compound earnings, it does not widen margins. But in a period where central banks themselves are buying it more aggressively as a neutral reserve asset, dismissing it entirely becomes lazy. Gold matters in a monopoly fade because it belongs to no one as promise. That is its role, not growth neutrality. And when the world becomes more fragmented, neutrality gains value. I would not build a fortune around gold, but I would not ignore why central banks are treating it like insurance. The third place I would look is commodities more broadly, not because I want to become a short-term trader chasing inflation headlines, because when the world order broadens, emerging markets industrialize, currencies diversify, and geopolitical stress keeps resource security in focus. The things that the world literally needs to run tend to become more strategically important: energy, metals, copper, food, adjacent supply chains, real assets. Again, I am not saying go all in and pretend you discovered a magic trick. I am saying understand the role. Commodities are one of the few areas that can behave like a useful hedge when inflation, supply shocks, or currency weakness start changing the texture of the world. The fourth place I would look is the United States itself, but with more discrimination. The lazy investor says, if America is not dead, I'll just keep buying everything as usual. That is not how I think. I want the best of the American machine, not a sleepy assumption that the whole machine will automatically produce the same kind of alpha it once did. That means I still want great American businesses, strong innovation, world-class technology, and the capital markets that support them. But I no longer want the fantasy that this alone is the whole answer, because it is not. This is how I would summarize the entire shift. The dollar is not collapsing. It is being diluted. America is not finished. It is becoming less singular. The world is not turning anti-American overnight. It is becoming less dependent on America as the sole center. Those are not dramatic changes in the emotional sense. They are dramatic changes in the investment sense, because for decades, an investor could get away with building a portfolio that assumed one center of gravity. The next decade is more likely to reward the investor who accepts that gravity itself is becoming more distributed. This is not a panic and sell everything moment. It is a rebalance, your mental model moment. That is much more important. The investor who wins from here is probably not the one who guesses every trade perfectly. It is the one who understands the shape of the shift and lets time work on top of that understanding. That means keeping strong American exposure, but refusing to worship it. It means adding international and emerging market exposure, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of realism. It means respecting gold and commodities as tools, not idols. It means refusing to believe that the old privilege can decay without changing returns. And above all, it means learning to think like a steward of capital in a bigger world, not like a patriot using a portfolio as a flag. I have always believed that the most dangerous sentence in finance is, "This is how it has always worked." That sentence has ruined more fortunes than bad luck ever did. If the old order gave America an extraordinary advantage, then even a partial fading of that advantage should matter to your portfolio. Not because you need to fear America, because you need to stop assuming America must continue rewarding concentration the same way it did when the dollar's privilege was more absolute. That privilege is still powerful. It is just no longer alone in the room. And once you see that clearly, the opportunity becomes obvious. The world is getting wider. The map of growth is getting broader. The set of investable winners is getting larger. And the people who benefit most will not be the ones who panic about the headline. They will be the ones who quietly reposition before everyone else realizes that the monopoly already started to fade.